And welcome everybody. I am very, very happy that so many of you could were able to join us for this webinar. I wanted to welcome my colleagues from the Census Bureau, Jenny Kim, Marisa Hotchkiss, and Jason Kopp, and who are going to talk about their project, 2020 Census Language Support in 59 non-English languages. Supporting 59 non-English languages is a significant effort by the Census Bureau, an effort that really expanded the reach of the 2020 census to 99% of households. This is the most robust language program that the Census Bureau has ever built. And in this presentation, Jenny, Marisa, and Jason will provide an overview and demonstration of different instruments, questionnaires, and materials in languages other than English, and discuss which processes, technologies, and tools they used. As Alex mentioned, you're welcome to go ahead and ask your questions in the chat box, and we will try to get to as many as we can. And with that, I am going to go ahead and pass it over to Jenny, Marisa, and Jason. Welcome.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jenny Kim, and thank you so much, Laura, for the invitation and for us to be able to speak with you today. My name is Jenny Kim. I have the privilege of leading the language support work for the 2020 census, and I am here with my esteemed colleagues, Marisa Hotchkiss and Jason Kopp, who will be joining me in sharing with you what all has been done for our 2020 census program. Before I even get started with this has just been a huge endeavor for us. This journey began actually after the previous census in 2010, assessing what had happened and the type of support that we gave, how will we envision what the next census in 2020 would be like. So we started looking into what that would look like starting in 2012. So it's been pretty much an 8-year journey for us. And we are happy to be at the finish line and sharing with you. And we hope not only to share this information with you, but also be a resource to you and how we can help in helping you and expanding your language operations as well. So I'm going to go on to the next slide, the agenda for today. Is we have 3 parts. So we are going to first, I will talk about what all of that planning entailed for us to result in the 2020 Census Language Support Program. So we'll be giving an overview of the census and our program. And then we'll go into the implementation part, what it meant for us to build the actual language support program, and then what resulted from it, which will be a walkthrough of our various innovations and products for our non-English support. So I will take the first part of planning, and then after my part of it, implementation result will be held by my colleagues, Jason and Marisa. So slide 3 is just our title for our first section and talking about the planning for the language program. I'm going on to slide 4 now. But before we can even talk about the type of support that's needed, I'd like to give you a quick overview of what the decennial census is about. So the decennial census is conducted every 10 years, and the purpose is to conduct an enumeration of population, housing, and then disseminate the results to the president, the states, and the American people. And this is mandated in Article 1, Section 2 of the U.S. Constitution. And our primary purpose of the decennial census is to apportion representation among the states in the House of Representatives, but there are many other important uses of the census data that include drawing congressional and state legislative districts, school districts, voting precincts, and census data are used to distribute more than $675 billion annually in funding to the states and local communities. If you look on the next slide, this gives you a snapshot of how we conduct the census and how we have made it easier than ever before for people to respond to the census, to count everyone once, only once, and in the right place. And in order to accomplish this, we first build the address list that you see the icon on the left side. This includes every address in the country, and this forms the basis of the census. Then we motivate people to respond. Now, self-response is responding to the census on your own, and self-response is one big component that the language support has taken charge of, and we have made this easier than ever. The 2020 census provides 3 modes in which people can respond, which would be internet, phone, and paper, in which multiple language options are available for people to self-respond. We also make sure that we count people in non-traditional housing, as well as provide an opportunity for people experiencing homelessness to be included in the count. And some households we know will simply not respond on their own. So we have an operation called non-response follow-up, where we will follow up with them by visiting the households that have not responded. And then at the end of it, finally, we tabulate and release the results, the census results, to the president and then to the country. In the next slide here, you will see, some of you may be thinking, and I know a lot of you have received our letters, how do we actually invite everyone in the nation to respond? So for every household in the US, we send an invitation to participate in the 2020 census, either through mail or through a census worker. So for 95% of the households in the US, we send the census invitation through the mail. And then for almost 5% of the households, we have census workers that drop off the invitations at their door. Now, these are mainly households that may not receive mail at their physical location, such as areas that use P.O. boxes or areas that have recently been affected by a natural disaster. Those are the areas we will actually visit with our workers and have them leave invitations at their door. And then for less than 1% of the households, we will have a census worker visit and collect the information instead of being invited to respond their own. These are very remote areas such as remote Alaska or select American Indian areas that have to be counted in person. But just to show you that these are the different ways that we really reach all of the households, all the addresses in which the bulk of the nation will receive it in the mail. If we look in the next slide here, this shows us 3 major ways that people can respond on their own that I talked about, which is through the online, phone, and mail. This is a huge expansion of previous censuses that we have done. Some of you may remember filling out the 2010 census or even the 2000 census, where this was paper only. So we mailed out all the paper questionnaires and everyone responded through the mail, or we had our interviewers visit them. In 2020, we expanded this option to the online option, as well as people being able to, at all times during the census cycle, to be able to call our phone centers and provide the responses, as well as ask questions. So this shows you a little bit of our timeline in which the 3 modes are used to collect the data. So now that I've given you a grasp of how what a mammoth task it is to even run the census, what we started doing from the language team is, now that we have this method in reaching all of the households for people to participate in the census, how do we provide our services and resources so that people who are not English speakers or who are limited English proficiency can still respond on their own in the language that we provide the assistance in. So looking at the slide, the next slide here, this is what we did to determine the language needs. What we have been doing since 2012 is assessing the trends and the changes of the language needs in the nation. And before I even get into this methodology, I like to kind of give a definition of how we define language support. So we hear things such as, well, there are certain numbers of people who speak certain languages. Why is it different? And the way that we reach this with our methodology is that we went after households that had a need where they did not have an adult who spoke English well, so that they were actually would be in a need of receiving language support. And I love to give this, and this is what we call a limited English speaking household. And I love to give this example. So if you look at where my parents live, I'm Korean American, and my parents live in California. Where they live, neither of my parents are proficient English speakers. So they would be categorized as a household that is an limited English speaking household. We look at my household here, a household of 1, where I am a Korean speaker, but also a proficient English speaker. So I would not be classified as a household that needs language assistance. So it wasn't really necessarily the numbers of speakers of a language that we gave assistance to, but it was the number of households where they actually had a demonstrated need for assistance in a non-English language. So, as I said, conducting a census is a mammoth task. And as we were planning for the census, we basically had to ensure, that was our goal, that linguistic barriers did not become an impediment in people being counted, as an example that I gave you. And I was happy to hear from my parents that they found the Korean online questionnaire very easy. And it was one of the first times that they didn't reach out to me for assistance and they did it on their own. So it gave us a lot of fulfillment that we did the right thing. Now, so this is where all of our language program comes into play. And as I have shared with you, we have done research throughout the decade to assess the language needs of the nation and best ways to provide our language assistance through our census instruments and materials. And how we came to determine all of that language support will be covered in detail later, but let me just give you a quick snapshot of how the languages were selected. The 2020 language needs were determined using the 2016 American Community Survey 5-year estimates. And if you look at the slide here, looking at the progression from left to the right, we first took ACS language data and created tabulations of languages that were spoken by limited English-speaking households. And in determining these households, we use the same ACS definition where there is no one 14 years or older who speaks English only or speaks English very well. So simply put, similar to what I said, a household that did not have an adult or someone who was over 14 years old who could speak English very well. Once we determined that through our American Community Survey data, those are the folks, those are the households that we identified being in need of it. So we took these tabulations and made a cutoff at 2,000 households per each language. So in other words, we generated a list of languages where each language had 2,000 or more households that were limited English speaking. Now, because we took the language needs at the national level, we also wanted to make sure that we were meeting the needs at the state level and the regional level as well. So for each of the census region and for each of the states, so that they are represented, we compare the list, our national list, with our regional and state level data to make sure that the top needs at each state or each region was reflected in our national list as well. And then as our final stop, we assessed the languages for translation feasibility and then also added American Sign Language to our list. So if you look at the next slide, this is the languages. These are the languages where we identified where 2,000 or more households spoke this language and were in need of assistance. So these are listed in the order of need. So you see, if you look from the left top, you see Spanish as being having the largest need. And then as you go down the column and then as you move right, this is the order that you would see. So this is in descending order, top to bottom, left to right. And by supporting these languages, we were able to support over 99% of all households in the US. And then if you look at this chart here, if you look at the first column, there are 12 languages. These were the languages where we made our instruments available in these languages. And by supporting the top 12 languages alone that you see in the leftmost column, we got to cover more than 85% of all limited English-speaking households in the US. And this is what led us to build the most robust language program that we have ever built for the census. Looking at the next slide, this will give you a quick overview and a summary of our support. So for our online support and our phone support, we have made these modes available in English and 12 non-English languages. So if you look on the very left side, our online questionnaire for the census had the content in English and these languages. They were Spanish, Chinese, Vietnamese, Korean, Russian, Arabic, Tagalog, Polish, French, Haitian Creole, Portuguese, and Japanese. Marisa later is going to give us a demonstration of what that online instrument looks like with the options in 12 languages, so I will not steal her thunder, but this is something that we have worked very diligently throughout the decade in order to accomplish this. where people can go, and some of you may have experienced it when you looked at the online questionnaire to see what the options were, is that basically our online questionnaire has mirror sites in all of these 12 languages. And it's very easy for people to go on our website and be able to select that language. And it's the exact same content, the same layout, same look and feel in all these languages. The phone option as well for the same languages that are supported online as well. We have these languages available where people can call our phone centers and ask questions about the census, as well as complete their census questionnaire over the phone with our bilingual agent. And each of these lines here, you'll see that for Chinese, we had 2 separate phone numbers for Mandarin and Cantonese. And what was really exciting that we were able to do is that for each of the language support, that there was a separate dedicated number for each language, so that one would not have to call our major number that's in English and try to fumble through the menu or different options or being rerouted to eventually to a bilingual agent, but they could call, for example, the Spanish phone number and go straight to the Spanish language options and being connected to a Spanish-speaking bilingual agent. All right, and then, so you may be asking, well, you talked about supporting all 59 different languages. How did that come into play? So for the languages that were outside of the top 12 languages, we also created guides for them. So for those, and you'll see the languages listed in the middle section where it says language guides and glossaries and language identification cards. Once again, we are going to do a thorough walkthrough of what that all looked like. But with this, for those outside of the top 12 languages who would have a need to fill out or learn about our census mode options in their language, we created guides both in video and print format that did a walkthrough of the census questionnaire in all of the 59 languages. And for those, our field workers and partnership specialists who work with non-English speaking communities, we also created language glossaries. That was a list of our list of commonly used census terms that were part of our census questionnaire content and part of our materials. We had of these terms translated to all 59 different languages, and a language identification card. I know some of you are familiar with that. The language identification card that featured a statement in 59 different languages so that we are able to identify what language our respondents are speaking. So this is a quick snapshot of what our language support came to. If you look to the far right, we also did our mailers when we sent the mailings to our households, as well as dropping them off for the areas where there was a high demonstrated need for bilingual English and Spanish. Those mailers were sent in a bilingual format as well. And then at the end of it, after the self-response period is over, when we have our interviewers going door to door for the households that do not respond on their own, we also have a handheld instrument that they will use that's completely bilingual in English and Spanish. And we will have bilingual agents that speak languages beyond Spanish to be able to assist people to complete their census as well. All right, so that brings me to the end of my section in terms of all of that planning that entailed. I'm now going to be handing it over to Jason, who's going to talk to us about how, now that we have this plan, what did the implementation look like, and what were different standards and quality processes that we had to go through and also establish within the Census Bureau in order to create these materials. So Jason, why don't I hand it over to you?
Thank you, Jenny. So I'm going to move to the next slide in terms of building a language support program. And we're going to have several slides here where we're going to talk specifically about translation. So in the 2010 census, as Jenny had mentioned early on in the presentation, there were some key recommendations that came out for how we would build the language program in 2020. And 2 of those key recommendations included creating a centralized translation area, which we were able to do as we started progressing towards building our translation program. And that area was called the Decennial Translation Branch. So as I believe Jenny mentioned earlier, I was the first chief of that branch when we started our operations in 2016. And the second key recommendation was hiring in-house translation experts. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that on the following slides too. And that was one of the first tasks that we had. In addition to hiring them, we wanted to make sure we adhered to industry standards, both for actually accomplishing translation and then for terminology research as well. And we're going to touch on that as well. And then we wanted to make sure that we could implement translation technology. We wanted to use the latest technology available to us to ensure consistency and efficiency in our work. So let's talk about all of that a little bit more and give you a little bit more details at a high level of exactly what an enterprise translation area at the Census Bureau would look like. So the idea of centralizing all the translation work, that was really important because it would mean two things would improve in terms of consistency. So we would be able to approach all the translation projects the same way because they would all be handled by the same area and the same staff. And by having a consistent approach, we would also make sure that we could have consistency in our outcomes. And by outcomes, I mean the overall terminology that was used for the translation product, since we have various products that are interrelated to each other, and the style of all of the translations done, as well as the quality. So we wanted to make sure that was consistent across the board. And when we hired translation experts, one thing that's a theme that I'll start talking about now, and you'll hear me repeat several times, was we looked at a holistic approach to translation. So a lot of times when people think about translation, they immediately think about the translators, and rightly so, because the translators are critical to producing translations. But we wanted to take a big picture view when we were creating this enterprise area at the Census Bureau to make sure that we could fit within all of the processes already in place at the Census Bureau and do innovative work with translation. And so what we did was when we hired translation experts, we hired them in 3 different areas. So we hired them in an area to do planning for the translation projects. So project managers that really understood the translation process. We hired language experts. So those are the translators and the reviewers, the individuals that would help us make sure that we were able to complete the translations. And then we also hired experts in technology that would help us utilize the latest translation tools. So that's how we started off. We thought, okay, enterprise translation, these are the key things we want to do. So how did we do those things? On this next slide, we have a little bit of information about translation industry standards. So the first thing we did when we started implementing this area was take a look at these standards. And the reason we looked at these standards was twofold. We wanted to, first of all, utilize the best practices that already existed in the translation industry. The translation industry is a mature industry. Translation has been around for as long as human beings have been able to write. So we knew we didn't need to reinvent translation. We just needed to make sure that we could grab the best practices that would work for what we were trying to accomplish at the Census Bureau and make sure we could utilize those practices. In addition to that, something that's great about industry standards is that they tend to define specific tasks that different individuals might need to do in order to complete the translation process. And by having specific definitions, we could make sure that everyone that was working on the projects had the same understanding of exactly what we needed them to do and what their job entailed. So those were the 2 main reasons that we wanted to use standards. What standards did we use? There's 3 that we used here that I'll highlight in terms of a high level type of approach to the standards. So the first one is from the International Organization for Standards. It's ISO 9001, Quality Management Systems. This one is not specific to translation, but it's very important because if you want to have high quality products for anything you're creating, this standard helps you focus on how to build systems or processes that will get you high quality. From the same International Organization for Standards is 17100, Translation Services. And then we also looked at an American standards organization, ASTM F2575, and their standard guide for quality assurance and translation. So these last 2, they're very specific to translation. If you're not familiar with them, what's important in terms of what we'll be presenting today is that they focus at a high level on breaking the translation process up into three main areas that you'll want to cover in order to ensure that you have high quality translations at the end of your process. And so the three areas are what is done before translation, what is done during translation, and what is done after translation. So I'm gonna be speaking about how we decided to implement all of those things for this translation area at the Census Bureau. And we'll return to those different areas. We'll spend a lot of time on the before and the after because the translation process itself is the process that we believe most people already understand the most since it's the most frequent process that's discussed. So on the next slide, we're going to look at the overall basic translation process that we implemented here at the Census Bureau. And I say overall because as we continue to go through this presentation, you'll see how this basic process gets incorporated into a larger process to produce the types of products we wanted and the quality we wanted. So if you look at the left side of the slide, you'll see translate. And this was the name for our translation process that you'll later see in a larger context. And there was three main steps in this process: translation, review, and quality assurance. So if you've done work with translations, if you've been involved in the translation industry, this is going to sound very standard and straightforward. But I'm gonna go through each of these steps in a little bit more detail to give you more information about how we applied these three different stages that I mentioned from the standard, and specifically what we were doing as we went through each of these steps. So for translation, one thing that we really focused on, again, was the planning. And so we made sure that we prepared requirements and we had detailed information about what we were supposed to be producing for every single translation project that we had. And by that, I mean, not only were we trying to figure out how much work would it be, you know, what languages, how many words, what was the time frame. Of course, we wanted to know all of that, but we wanted to know who was the target audience. What was the outcome supposed to be by using this translation? What was the effect that was supposed to be had? What was the final format? Was it going to be a video? Was it going to be audio? Was it going to be some type of advertisement? Was it going to be an online application? So we spent a lot of time understanding what the final product was supposed to be and what it was supposed to do so that we could document that and make sure that we took that into consideration when we planned out the translation process. Once we did all that, of course, we started translation and we had professional translators work on all of our documents. And we'll talk a little bit more about how we selected translators in our next slide. Once we finished the translation, we moved into the review process. And again, this is a very standard process for quality assurance in the translation industry, where after an initial translation is completed, it's reviewed by a second translator. They proofread the entire document, make any corrections in terms of spelling, in terms of concepts if they were misunderstood, and just do general editing. They also check all of the formatting in the translation. So we always had those two steps. And then the third step, quality assurance, we broke up in this slide into two different sections. And the reason that we broke those up into two different sections is, as you recall, Jenny mentioned that we were working on a number of different products and some of them in 59 languages. So we wanted to make sure, first of all, that we did quality assurance within each language and across the products within that language. And that meant things like making sure that terminology from our glossaries had been used, style guidance had been followed, and all the translations were complete. We also did reviews for consistency in terms of spelling, grammar, punctuation, and capitalization. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later as well. But then in addition to that, we did quality assurance across languages. So we wanted to make sure that if we came up with a certain type of solution, for example, guidance on how to translate the term Census Bureau, that we would make it as applicable as possible to all of the languages that we were working on. And even if something couldn't apply to every language, we tried to make sure that we had consistency within language families. For example, if you were going to be translating householder into Spanish, we wanted to make sure, if possible, that the process we took would also apply to other Romance languages. So this is the overview of the very basic process. We're going to talk a little bit more about how we were able to implement this process and how using these standards to come up with both the people that we needed to work on the process and then also the planning to make sure the process would work. So on the next slide, we're going to talk about translation experts. So what we did in order to make sure we had the right people to get the outcomes that we needed was we went through a process where we looked at the overall scope of our work. And you can see on this slide, this repeats a little bit of what we talked about in the first slide about the decennial translation branch area and the type of work that we need to do, that we need to adhere to standards. We wanted to make sure there was consistency and quality in the overall products that we were creating. And we wanted to make sure that we were using technology, translation, memory, and terminology databases. So we looked at that scope. We looked at the standards that we mentioned earlier, and we tried to figure out what do these standards say about the different individuals that will be taking part in each of these different segments of our work, whether it was the planning or the actual translation or using the technology. And once we did that, then we came up with requirements for the type of individuals that we would want to hire for each area. And here I am going to focus on the translators because I think this is something that anyone who's worked in translation will feel like they'll understand right away how we were approaching this. But we also took the same approach for any of the other areas that we were looking to hire staff in. So for translators, we wanted to make sure that at a minimum, the qualifications were that they had a university issued degree or certificate in translation in the language combination and the direction that they were translating in, accreditation by a professional translation association or union, or 3 or more years of professional experience. All of that in the language combination in the direction that we were going to have them working in. In addition to that, we wanted to make sure that they had experience working on surveys and they had a general understanding of statistics because we knew that that was going to be really important to translating the documents we were working on. The people that would complete the review part of the process that we mentioned on the slide earlier, we wanted to make sure that those individuals, which we called senior editors, had some additional qualifications. So at least 5 years of professional experience completing work in that language and in that direction, at least 3 years of professional experience as a translation editor, completing work in the language combination and direction, and at least 3 years of professional experience working on translations and editing them related to statistics. And again, we came up with these requirements based off of the standards and based off of the products that we were going to be creating and trying to make sure that we would be meeting that need. So now we've talked about the overall process and we have talked about how we went about hiring individuals that could help us implement this process. Let's go back to the planning part because there were some fairly important things that we thought about planning before we actually started having people begin translations. And one of those things was establishing clear policies for the translators. So we really wanted to set up our translators for success. And in order to do that, we spent time before we began our work developing and documenting a number of policies. So one of the first things was we went through the industry standards we mentioned, and we found if there was areas that were going to be relevant to the work that the translators were doing, that we made sure we documented that and we could share that with the translators. We came up with guidance specific to every language before we began working on the projects in that language. And that would include if there was multiple alphabets that could be used for writing in that language, what alphabet were we going to use? If there was multiple versions or dialects of the language, what would we use for our translations? If there was various options for how you might spell words in the language, what guidance would we follow? Anything related to capitalization, and that was a great example of something that we wanted to make sure while specific to languages, so it would be appropriate to try to make as uniform as possible across our products so they could all be seen as something the Census Bureau had created. So we spent time documenting that type of guidance specific to each language. We also made sure that we followed any overall agency policies and gave direction to the translators about those policies. An example being the translation of an agency name, whether it's the Census Bureau or if we had to refer to another agency, how would we approach translating those names? And last, we also made sure that any requirements that were specific to a project, that we would document those and give specific instructions to the translators before they would begin their work. And that included if there was formatting that was different for that project that the translators needed to implement, if they needed to use specific fonts, if the project required a different file type, if the output of the project needed to be different than the source text itself. All of that we documented to make sure that we could communicate it to the translators before they would begin. As you'll see at the bottom of the slide, we have some tips that as we went through this process, we wanted to share with anyone that would be doing translation work in the government in the future. And one tip we had after we had created all this documentation was to make sure that if there's going to be anyone doing translations projects with frequent languages or various files that are all related, that it is really important to provide style guidance and terminology databases and to incorporate standards before the project begins. So that was one thing that we did to make sure that when we started doing our translation work, we'd be successful. Another thing we did was come up with communication processes because we knew we had a lot of work, a lot of different products we'd be working on. We knew they were all interrelated. And we knew that as we were finalizing the products, there might be a number of changes that we'd need to make quickly. So we made sure we set up a communication protocol with the translators. And the main things we focused on were ways for the translators to communicate with us if they had questions and to address their questions. This is really important because we wanted to make sure that the translators understood how we would be using the products in the end and could make decisions about translation based on our guidance. We wanted to make sure if there was a change or if there was some sort of issue that came up with a translation and that something needed to be changed in other documents, that we could communicate with the translators and make sure we did that across the board. And then any feedback that came from the review process or any of the quality assurance that we did afterwards, we wanted to make sure we could also quickly communicate that to the translators and come up with ways to resolve those issues. And another tip that we have based on setting up this protocol is that we highly recommend after any major projects doing lessons learned sessions with the translators, because those end up being a really good way to have an ongoing way to improve and refine the communication and the overall process that you're using for translation. So we talked a lot about the preparation. One last thing on preparation before we actually began doing our translations was we made sure that we had technology available that would assist us with the overall process, that would improve our efficiency and help with our consistency. And so we ended up selecting a translation tool that had two components that we thought were extremely important to the work we were doing. And those two components are a terminology database and a translation memory database. So I'm going to explain quickly at a high level what those two things are. So the terminology database was a database of key terms that were related to the 2020 census in English and their translation in all of the languages that we worked on. And we set up that database first before we began any of our translation work to make sure we could define how we wanted translators to translate those specific terms. And then in the translation tool we worked with, whenever they would come across a term, they would automatically be notified that that term was in our database and there's a translation that they should be using. Translation memory is similar, but it's a little bit different. And what translation memory did is you can see on this slide where it says source text and target text, we have an English column and a Spanish column. And translation memory would allow the translators, as they went through and translated a document, to save every single sentence and its translation in a database. And then later on, if translators began work on a new document, anything they had translated previously would automatically show up from the database for them so they can make sure they were consistent with that previous translation. And it would also prove efficiency, because if they need to make any updates, they could just quickly make the updates to the previous translation. Something that is critical if you work with translation tools, and this is why we focused on hiring people that knew technology and would be able to help us with technology, is to regularly audit these tools to make sure that you have all of the most recent translations incorporated. If you work on a lot of languages, like we are working with 59 languages, and if you work on a number of different products, this is so critical to make sure that you can have consistency between all of the products, that both your databases are regularly updated, the terminology database and the translation memory database. Okay, so last thing that we're gonna cover is actually what happens after translation review. So we talked a lot about how we came up with our processes. We talked about how we prepared to begin doing translation work. Now I wanna start covering the quality assurance process. And this is again from the basic workflow that I showed you earlier. And we're gonna cover what that was, that basic workflow for any of our translations. And then I'm gonna pass it over to Marisa, and she's gonna start talking about how that workflow became expanded to make sure that we could get the quality we needed for the products that we were creating for the 2020 census. So from the translation perspective, when we were completing a translation had been translated and reviewed, then the translations came back and we would do a quality assurance process on them. So in order to do that, there was basically a checklist of items that we would go through and make sure were completed. So first, we would make sure that the translations adhered to whatever established standards we had documented before we began the project. So any of the language specific standards, any other policies about how we use terminology in our organization or specific formatting, we would go through and check all of those items. Once we were done with that, we would make sure that all terminology in the term base had been utilized correctly in the translation. We would go through the translation memory database and make sure that any previously translated text was consistent with the translations.
You have a call from 1116.
Then we would make sure that there was no text that was missing or displaying incorrectly. We would make sure all formatting was consistent with our requirements that we had established, and then any other requirements in terms of file format, fonts, etc., we would check all of those things. If there were any issues, we would go back through the translation review process to correct those issues. But at the bottom, we have an advanced tip that alludes to something that Marisa is going to start speaking about in the coming slides, which was, depending on what type of product you have, depending on how your translation will be used, you might need to expand this process. So one way that that could be done, especially if there's going to be a specific group of users, like the general public of your translation, is to engage experts that are familiar with the style of product that you're going to be creating and can give feedback on it, and that can also test the product with the intended audience to make sure that the translations are accurate, meaningful, and culturally relevant to those individuals. So I'm gonna pass this on to Marisa so she can start walking you through how we expanded the quality assurance process.
All right, hello, thanks, Jason. So quality assurance loops through every phase of our projects. As Jason explained, in the planning phase, we're planning for quality assurance. We're including it in our contracts, in our project plans, and in the guides and standards. And then when a translation is being reviewed, it's really carefully reviewed against the established requirements and standards to ensure that it's really of optimal quality. But finally, for 2020 census translations, we validate our translations through a robust testing process. So on the next slide, oh, Jason, can you hear me? Thank you. So you may notice this graphic is similar to a translation graphic that Jason showed earlier, and that's because they are both part of the overall process, which I'll show in a moment. But within our testing process, we use three main pre-testing techniques. So expert review. In this process, the translations are reviewed by experts in both survey methodology and the relevant language. Second, cognitive testing, where translated text is tested with recruited respondents of diverse demographics who also speak various dialects of the languages. And then finally, through usability testing. So in this step, translated versions of our questionnaires, such as our internet questionnaire in 12 non-English languages, are used by recruited respondents to ensure that people are able to easily navigate through the screens and provide accurate responses. So on the next slide, similar to what Jason covered earlier, key to this effort is aligning with established best practices and engaging the right experts. For our 2020 census, we worked with experts who have extensive experience in survey methodology and the pre-testing techniques. But what I want to especially call out on this slide is it's critical for those experts to also be proficient in the relevant language and to have experience with testing in that language. On the next slide, I want to leave you with some examples of why both quality control and testing are needed. On the slide are just a few examples that we found in preparing for the 2020 census. So on the first row, one of our areas of focus is the impact of text expansion. During quality control, we're reviewing the translated text against requirements, including the length of the document or perhaps a character limit for a field. And this helps us ensure that all of the translated text is visible and it's correctly placed in the design. In addition, testing helped us understand that some subtle changes in line breaks affected the message and had the potential to create confusion for our respondents. So another area of focus are the fonts. During quality control, we can confirm that the fonts are optimal for the language and that we're using fonts that are compatible with the design or the program software. Testing helped us see that some software programs will occasionally substitute characters, and even subtle differences such as using a sans serif font or a visually simpler font had the potential to create confusion. And finally, for layout, while we attempt to anticipate the needs of respondents, testing is crucial to validating these assumptions. During quality control, we ensure all text was aligned right to left to match Arabic text, but our testing showed us that some respondents in the US expected some fields, such as phone numbers, to be aligned left to right. So both of these two phases are critical to making sure that the translations are accurate, meaningful, and culturally relevant. So on the next slide, this is our full translation workflow. Jenny explained the planning phase beginning on the left-hand side and the data-driven process that we use to analyze language needs for the 2020 census. And Jason did a phenomenal job of explaining the translation process, wherein we translate, review, and complete the quality assurance both within and across languages. During development, we're ensuring that all text appears as intended, and we adjust questionnaire formatting and features as necessary. During testing, each translated screen is reviewed by experts in survey methodology and the language, and tested with respondents of diverse demographics. In the update step, the findings from testing are taken back to the translation team, and translations are updated and finalized. Quality assurance, again, within and across languages, is completed again. And in the finalization step, we confirm that all of the text appears as intended and the findings from testing have been implemented. So now that you have a good foundation to understand how we developed the non-English materials, we're pleased to show you the end result. So Jason, if you can go on to the next slide. The result, the products. This is the internet questionnaire, and let me highlight a few key features. On the landing page, there's a globe icon that allows people to choose a language, which you can see near that orange arrow. And this is not the only opportunity respondents have to select languages. The language links also appear at the bottom of every screen. So Jason, if you can go on to the next slide. every screen has the same look and feel regardless of language. So I'm going to let this run for just a second so you can see a sample of the landing page in each of the 12 non-English languages. Okay. And then got one more here. All right. And next slide. All right, the Census Questionnaire Assistance is our telephone response operation. And again, this provides an opportunity for people to respond to the 2020 census over the phone in English and in 12 non-English languages. Each of our supported languages has its own dedicated phone number, including separate phone numbers for Mandarin and Cantonese. And these numbers are listed on the back of an insert that comes in that first mailed invitation that Jenny spoke about. So one side includes information about how to access the internet questionnaire, and one side includes all of the phone numbers for calling questionnaire assistance. Okay, on the next slide, we send bilingual English and Spanish mail packages to Spanish tracts. So these are tracts in which at least 20% of the occupied housing units have at least one adult who speaks Spanish and does not speak English very well. So these households receive all mailing materials in an English-Spanish bilingual format. It is important to note that households in all other tracts received English materials, but they did include a sentence in Spanish directing respondents to either respond online or call a dedicated Spanish phone number. Okay, next. So the Census Bureau provides both video and print language guides in 59 non-English languages. First, I'll show you the video language guide. You can go to the next one, thank you. Video language guides are narrated in 59 non-English languages, and they assist respondents in responding online. Each video includes basic information about the 2020 census, a quick tour of the internet questionnaire, and detailed translations of the screens. And the print language guide, written in 59 non-English languages, assists respondents in filling out the paper questionnaire. So again, the guide includes critical information about the census and detailed translations of the questions themselves. And one quick note, the Census Bureau also provides templates of the language guides for language communities beyond the 59 to create their version of the language guides. Next. All right, and as Jenny mentioned, when interviewers begin visiting homes that have not responded, they will carry a language identification card, which is shown here. When an enumerator encounters a language barrier at the door, they'll be able to show this language identification card, which features a brief statement. You can see that in the blue speech bubble. And that statement has been translated into 59 non-English languages. And the interviewers also have access to an instrument that allows them to toggle between English and Spanish text as needed. And finally, the next slide. These are the language glossaries. Bilingual interviewers and other census staff use language glossaries to ensure consistency within translations of key census terms. So these glossaries include the professional translations of more than 300 key terms used in 2020 census materials. I realize that was quite the speed round here, but we did want to leave time for question and answers at the end. So with that, I will open it back up. I know we've seen a number of questions roll in.
Thank you. That was an amazing presentation. Yes, and so in the interest of time, I will try to get to as many as we can here. One of the questions is the online Chinese in traditional or simplified? And how did you decide?
Hi, this is Jenny. For our internet questionnaire, it is in simplified Chinese. However, in our language guides for the paper guide, the 59 that Marisa just showed not too long ago, that's available both in simplified and in traditional. And then in our video guide, we have a closed captioning that's also available in simplified and in traditional.
Another question is, how many languages was the last census done in?
In 2010, our questionnaire was available in 5 non-English languages versus the 12 that we did for online and for phone. And another part of that was in 2010, people would have to call our phone center for a non-English questionnaire to be mailed to them, wait for that mail to come to their boxes, and then be able to fill it out and mail it back. This time for 2020, we eliminated that entire process. So not only did we expand it from 5 languages to 12 languages, we eliminated that entire process where they can just go online or call our phone centers and fill out their questionnaires that way.
Great. I know that there is interest about the glossaries, and I would like to say, because people would like to see them and use them. And so we have, I'll connect with you privately because we have a glossary page in DigitalGov. So if we could just publish them there, we just disseminate them to the community.
Oh, absolutely. We'd be happy to share that. Yeah, not a problem at all. And I have to say, when we were creating our translation office several years back, other agencies were so graciously sharing their information, their resources with us as well. So we would love to give back, and I'll make those available to you. Wonderful.
Thank you. Another question, if I may. I know we're right at 2:30, but if people can hang on for a couple of seconds, perhaps we can get to the 2 or 3 more questions. Wondering if standards also take into account low literacy and hard to count populations.
So we do not have data in terms of literacy rates within the language groups. So we basically just use the same data that I talked about with American Community Survey, looking at limited English speaking households, but nothing beyond that in terms of looking at the literacy breakdown from that.
Okay, and how much of the QA process was automated versus manual? And what is the balance of cost effort on translation versus QA?
Wow. Well, it was hours and hours and hours of manual QA. We had made a commitment. Unfortunately, during 2010 census, we had a couple of snafus with our translations that were publicly slightly embarrassing. So we had made a commitment not to make that mistake again for our next census, and we did not. But that meant hours and hours of manual process and looking at everything through our own eyes. We did use some automation to help flag some issues, but everything was QC'd manually.
Okay. How did you make decisions about policies and standards? For example, selecting a dialect or alphabet, such as detailed expertise needed for each language?
For that, we really relied on data. So we looked at, for example, looking at the language needs. And when we looked at the dialect, we really wanted to use a neutral format of that language so we can reach as many speakers of that language as possible. So for example, for Spanish, we get that question a lot, which sides of Spanish to use. We basically use neutral Spanish, using terms that will be neutrally accessible through different regions. So those are some of the decisions we made. Us having a translation office that was established formally in 2016, that became our central place where all of our translation policies and standards were created and had the authority to do that for the agency.
Okay, we have 2 more questions. So if you can hang on 1 more minute, we can get to them. Are you all translators on staff? How many, or do you manage this through several contracts?
Sure, very good question. So we have 3 different venues. We have an in-house staff who are English and Spanish translators, and then we have translation researchers and project managers, but we also have a contract with a vendor where they provide the translation services. And then we also have a second contract where we work with our multilingual researchers to do our cognitive testing. So yes, in-house translators, contract translation company, and a contract research company.
And the last question is, where did the push to expand language product services, where did it come from? And was it a result of policy regarding LEP access, issues, responses, or, if you could just explain that.
Yeah, so Census has always been, I would have to say, in the forefront of reaching as many people as possible who are non-English speakers. This was just a continuation of what we had established in the past. And for the census, we need to count everyone in the nation, everyone once, only once, and in the right place. And the best way we can do that is to expand our language efforts as much as possible so that linguistic barriers do not become an impediment for everyone in the nation to be counted.
Great. Thank you so much. I think unless, there's anything else, somebody said that they love the globe. So kudos for you to you for that. So there are very many very nice comments. So anyways, thank you so much to the Census Bureau for this fantastic presentation. And thank you everybody who could participate and for your great questions. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.